Hi friends. Tonight, we embark on a slow, shadowy journey into the past, into the heart of medieval Britain during the so-called Dark Ages, a time often cloaked in myth, mystery, and mud. Our tale isn't of knights in shining armour or grand castles glittering on the hill, but of the quiet, heavy lives of those who laboured in their shadows, the peasants. Across 20 parts, we shall walk barefoot beside them, taste the coarse bread of survival, and lie beneath the same smoky thatched roof. This first chapter introduces us to their world, starting with the break of day in a village not marked on any map. Let us begin. The rooster's crow was not a gentle nudge into morning. It was sharp, abrupt, and final. There was no such thing as sleeping in when you were a peasant. For most, the day began before the sun even dared peek above the hills, and the cock's call was less an alarm and more a decree. One couldn't afford to ignore the king of the yard. In the quiet dark of a small smoky hut, young Ewan blinked open his eyes to a ceiling of soot-stained thatch. The air was still thick from last night's fire, now nothing more than grey coals in the hearth. He reached up to scratch at the bites along his shoulder. Fleas, perhaps, or lice. It hardly mattered anymore. The hut, like all others in the village, was built of woven sticks and daubed mud. The walls wept in the damp, and even in summer the chill clung to the bones. There were no separate rooms, only shadows behind woolen cloths and the scent of shared breath. The family, 6 of them, slept together on sacks stuffed with straw, the older ones curling around the young for warmth. Outside, the frost still kissed the grass, and the sky was a weary blue, streaked with the promise of another hard day. Before the first chore, there was always a moment of silence. Not for reflection or prayer, but simply because speech felt like too much effort. The body needed every grain of strength it could hoard. Breakfast was whatever remained from the night before, usually a heel of rye bread gone hard enough to crack a tooth. If fortune smiled, there might be some thin pottage, stewed greens and barley, with a flavour that came not from spices, for they were the luxury of lords, but from the long boiling over the hearth. There was no coffee, no bacon sizzling, no porcelain cup to cradle, only the wooden bowl shared between siblings and the knowledge that eating slowly meant less food for others. By the time the village bell rang, a rusted cowbell strung from the central oak, it was time to work. For boys like Ewan, the day meant the fields. Not his own, of course. Peasants didn't own land. They toiled on the manor's fields, the domain, land that belonged to the lord, who himself might never be seen except when taxes were due or soldiers marched through. With a heavy hoe over his shoulder, Ewan stepped onto the muddy path between cottages. His feet were bare, always. Boots were a thing of envy, patched and passed down through generations, if one was lucky enough to ever own a pair. The village buzzed with the same grim energy it held every morning. Oxen being yoked, hens squawking, in resistance to being disturbed, and women lugging buckets toward the well, sleeves rolled and arms chapped red. No one spoke of dreams or hopes. The sky was clouding, and that was what mattered. In the fields, the soil clung to everything. It was not a soft, loamy earth, but heavy clay that sucked at your steps and cracked the skin of your palms. Planting, hoeing, and harvesting, depending on the season, were done in endless rows under the disapproving gaze of the reeve. Another peasant, but one appointed to ensure the rest worked hard enough. There were no rest days, not truly. Sundays were for church, yes, but even then, one had to clean, fetch water, mend tools, or gather kindling. The church spoke of heavenly reward and the meek inheriting the earth. But to the peasants, this was distant thunder. The priest himself was often better fed than the villagers, and his sermons, delivered in Latin, were mostly unintelligible. Midday came without warning. Only the growing ache in the stomach hinted at the hour. Lunch, if it could be called that, was again bread, perhaps a wedge of cheese if there was milk to spare, and water drawn from a well that sometimes reeked after rain. Still, they drank. There was no choice. Ewan would sometimes glance toward the horizon, where the manor house perched on its rise like a crouching beast. The Lord might be within, dining on meat and honey, speaking French with visiting knights. To Ewan, it was another world, untouchable, gilded, and barely real. Afternoon passed like the morning, endless furrows, blistered hands, and the threat of being seen resting. Punishment for idleness was not kind. Fines, stocks, or worse. Even children were not exempt. The village was bound together by necessity and fear. Fear of hunger, of illness, of the Lord's displeasure. As the sky began to dim, the village breathed a rare sigh. Work ended not because one chose it, but because light failed. Inside the huts, the fire was coaxed back to life. A pot was set to boil, turnips and leeks mostly. Meat was rare, usually only during feasts or when an animal died of old age. Salt was precious, and herbs were few. Families huddled together, eating in silence. There was no time for storytelling or laughter, not in Ewan's household. Weariness clung like another layer of grime. When the darkness fully claimed the world and the wind began to howl, the shutters were closed, if one had them. Otherwise, holes were plugged with rags. There were no lamps, just firelight and the occasional candle saved for childbirth or illness. Ewan lay back on the straw mat, listening to the snores and coughs of his kin, the scratching of rats in the corners, and the long, slow groan of the wind against the thatch. This, he thought, was life, and it would be the same tomorrow. By the flickering hush of firelight, the sound that haunted peasant nights was not the howl of wolves or the whisper of ghosts. It was the low, persistent grumble of empty bellies. Hunger was not a season. It was not something that came and went like summer or frost. Hunger lived with them, sat beside them, slept beneath the straw with their children, and curled in the aching gut with every sunrise. This was the weight of existence in the Dark Age village of Glinham Hollow, where our young peasant Ewan lay in bed with sleep elusive and hunger familiar. Even in the best of harvests, food was never secure. The rye might come in well one year, but then a damp summer would rot it in the fields the next. A swarm of beetles, a sudden frost, or a too heavy rain could undo months of labour. But in truth, even the good years were stingy. The Lord took his due first. His share was measured not by fairness, but by ancient custom and threat. Then came the church's tithe, a tenth of all produce, taken with divine justification and solemn faces. What remained was rarely enough. Children learned, young not to ask for more. Mothers would chew a crust and pretend to eat, slipping their portion into the bowl of a son or daughter when they thought no one watched. The old often died in winter, their voices fading into the cold because there simply wasn't enough food to keep everyone alive. And so hunger was not just an ache, it was a presence. It dictated behaviour. It stirred resentment. It fueled quarrels over turnips, over bread gone stale, over a borrowed sack of barley that could not be repaid. Ewan remembered once seeing a traveller passing through, thin as a reed, but with a bag that bulged with food, dried meats, apples, even a jug of something that smelled sweet. The villagers had watched him like wolves, eyes hollow and silent. He had left before dawn, sensing the tension. Some said he was wise. Others said he was lucky not to be found with his throat cut. There were no markets in Glinham Hollow. The fire. Nearest trade fair was held twice a year in a town 3 days' walk away, but peasants could rarely leave their villages. They were bound to the land, both legally and by the weight of responsibility. Livestock needed tending, crops could not wait, and the manor's work came first. To leave without permission could be punished, harshly, so the village had little trade and less variety. Diet was monotony. Bread, pottage, maybe an egg if the hens were generous. The wealthy dined on beef, duck, spices from the east. The peasants? They boiled the same stew for days, thickening it with scraps. It was said a good pot never truly emptied. It simply absorbed the next day's offering, like a memory one couldn't wash away. In winter, the world grew small. The sun barely touched the sky before sinking. Food stores dwindled. Rats were bold. Children grew listless. Cabbage and onions were the treasures of January, kept in root cellars or buried beneath hay. Sometimes they turned. Sometimes they were eaten anyway. There were no luxuries. Honey was for the priest. Salt was measured like gold. Fruit was a fleeting summer gift, gone before one could savor it. There were berries, yes, and mushrooms, but foraging was risky. The wrong mushroom could steal your breath forever. The wrong berry could end a child's life before the next moon. One girl, Elfwin, no older than Ewan's sister, had died that way the previous spring. Her lips turned black, and her mother wept with the knowledge that the meal meant to feed had instead stolen. When illness came, as it often did, hunger made it worse. Bodies without nourishment could not fight. A cough could become a death rattle. A fever might mean a funeral by week's end. And even in mourning, the question hung, heavy. Who would do her share of the work now? The village shared what it could, but there was little to give. Charity was a candle in the storm. Brief, flickering, beautiful, but never enough to push the darkness back. Ewan's memories of his younger brother were shaped by this. Little Thomas had been born during a harsh frost. He was pale, soft, and silent. His mother had tried, wrapping him close, sharing what food she could. But her milk dried up quickly, and there was no cow to suckle him. The herbs offered by the village wise woman helped little. Thomas had lived 7 days. They buried him under the old yew, where the earth was soft enough to yield, even in January. No marker, no ceremony. Just a whispered prayer and the hope he'd not feel hunger where he went. Even the church, with its lofty words and carved stone altars, offered no real balm for hunger. The priest spoke of heaven's feast, where no man would go hungry, where cups overflowed and angels sang. But heaven was far away, and the stomach could not wait. Sometimes the villagers would gather at the edge of the woods and wonder aloud what it would be like to hunt. Deer roamed there, fat and unaware. But hunting was forbidden. The king claimed the forest. Poaching was a crime, a hanging offence, if caught. Yet it happened. A few brave souls snuck into the woods beneath the moonlight, returning with bloody hands and trembling eyes. Once, a stag was brought down, and its meat was shared beneath silence and watchful glances. For 3 days, there was laughter in Glenham Hollow. Children ran, songs were sung, but the reeve found out. The skins were discovered, buried shallow, behind a hut. 2 men were taken to the manor and flogged. One never walked again. The joy curdled into fear. The hunger returned, and so, the peasants learned the cruel arithmetic of survival. Share and suffer, hoard and be hated. And always, always, hunger endured. Ewan, on such a night as this, rolled over in the straw, his belly aching. Tomorrow, perhaps, there would be mushrooms near the river, or nettles to boil. Perhaps someone would catch a squirrel or trap a crow, but even as he closed his eyes, he knew there would never be enough. Even in the faintest moments of peace, when the fields were quiet and the fire warm, the peasant's body remained at war. But this battle was not fought with sword or spear. It was a quiet, crawling war waged in the skin, the lungs, and the gut. One waged against filth, fever, and the steady hand of disease. In Glenham Hollow, illness was not exceptional. It was expected. Each cough, each chill, each boil or rash was another chapter in a story that began in birth and ended far too soon. Cleanliness, as we understand it, did not exist, not from negligence, but because it was simply beyond reach. Water was drawn from a communal well down a winding path where chickens defecated freely and pigs rooted through mud. This same water was used for cooking, washing, and drinking. It was often cloudy, sometimes tinged green in summer and sharp with the taste of iron. But there was no choice. Boiling was reserved for soup. Firewood was precious. No one wasted it on water unless they were desperate. Bathing was rare and never private. The stream was cold and shallow. Soap, if it could be called that, was made from ashes and fat, sharp and gritty on the skin. Most peasants simply rinsed when they could, wiping with coarse linen or leaves, scrubbing away sweat with sand. Hair was kept short, not for fashion, but for fleas. Even still, the little creatures made homes in every fold of fabric and every thatch of bedding. Ewan often scratched until his arms were raw. His mother tried herbal poultices, plantain and dock leaves ground into a sticky smear, but the itching always returned. In the night, he could hear his siblings shifting and scratching, a symphony of discomfort. Rats were everywhere. Bold and clever, they scurried through thatch and under doors, drawn to crumbs, to warmth, to anything soft enough to gnaw. Their droppings mingled with food. Their bites sometimes festered, but they were simply another part of life. Like rain, like taxes. Then there were the flies. Come summer, the air shimmered with their wings. They landed on wounds, on bread, on eyes too tired to swat them away. Every child bore scabs, some from insects, some from boils, others from unknown causes. Infection was common, and there was no word for antibiotic. There were prayers, there were herbs, there was hope. The wise woman, Aelith, knew more than most. She was grey-haired, bent-backed, and sharp-tongued, with hands stained green from years of gathering. She brewed teas of feverfew and meadowsweet, applied poultices of comfrey and yarrow. Her hut smelled always of damp roots and smoke. Some villagers feared her, whispering of old gods and darker rites. But when fever struck, they came, always. For the Lord's physician was not theirs. He tended only to those of noble birth, and he would not stoop to touch a peasant's brow, not for love nor coin. Aelith charged nothing, but accepted food, cloth, or firewood in trade. She could not cure all. Many still died, but some lived who otherwise would not. She taught Ewan once how to make a balm from nettles and pig fat, how to staunch a cut with cobwebs and whisper charms for strength. Still, disease moved faster than knowledge. When the cough came, and it always came, it rattled the ribs like a drum. Children coughed themselves purple. Old men coughed themselves into graves. Winters were worst. Cold air crept through every chink, and the smoke from indoor fires clung low, blackening lungs and ceilings alike. No chimney, only a hole in the roof, and hope the smoke might find it. Ewan's grandmother had died of the cough. One night she simply fell quiet, her breaths growing soft, then slower, then gone. They wrapped her in a shroud and buried her beneath the hill near the sheep pens, where the ground was soft enough to dig without tools, and always the sickness returned. There were other plagues too, unseen, but deadly. The bloody flux, they called it, which left the body drained and pale. Fevers that burned so hot the mind broke. Children who slept and never woke. Mothers who bled too long after childbirth. Wounds that blackened and wept. None had names then, just signs, just endings, and the church, for all its grandeur, offered few answers. The priest spoke of sin, of punishment, of God's will. Illness, he said, was a test, a way to purge impurity. Suffering brought one closer to heaven, but these were cold, comforts for those whose children wasted away before their eyes. One particularly cruel spring, a sickness took 3 in a single week. A boy of 7, a girl just learning to walk, and a man too young to be called old. The village dug 3 graves, said 3 rushed prayers, and returned to work. There was no time for mourning. The barley needed planting. Ewan, though only a boy, began to understand something bitter and deep. That health was not a right. It was a gift, easily taken, seldom returned. You could drink clean water and still die. You could eat well 1 week and fall the next. The body was a fragile vessel, and no one, not even the strong, was safe from the rot that grew in wounds or the chill that crept into bones. There were no hospitals, no warm beds waiting in whitewashed halls. There were only huts and firelight and whispered prayers. There were only hands like Alith's, calloused, wrinkled, stained, but steady and kind. When night fell and the coughing began again, soft at first, then rising like waves, Ewan lay still, listening. The sound came from across the hut, where his sister huddled beneath their mother's arm. It was not deep yet, not the death rattle, but it had begun. He closed his eyes, and he hoped. In Glinham Hollow, there was no parchment to declare your fate, no seal pressed in wax to bind your path. And yet, from the moment a child first cried beneath a smoke-stained roof, their future was already carved into the clay of the land. There was no escaping it. You were born a peasant, and you would die one, beneath the same sky, upon the same soil, owned not by yourself, but by another. This was the true weight of feudalism, not the lash, not the hunger, but the certainty, the immovable truth that no matter how strong, how clever, how good one was, the ladder had no rungs for you. You were serf, villain, cotar. Names differed, but the chains remained. To Ewan, the Lord was more myth than man. He lived far beyond, the edge of the village behind stone walls and iron gates, served by squires and priests. He owned the manor. But more than that, he owned the people. His permission was required to marry, to move, even to inherit a cow. His word was law, and his absence, in some ways, only made his power more vast. The land, all of it, was his. The pastures, the woods, the riverbank where Ewan fished, each was lordly property, granted in kindness, not in right. The villagers worked what was called the tenant strip, narrow bands of land assigned each year, rotated according to custom, but never truly theirs. They were stewards, never owners. Even the tools they used, ploughs, scythes, carts, were often shared or borrowed. A snapped ploughshare might mean a season ruined, and heaven help the man who damaged the Lord's oxen. Compensation could mean forfeiting the winter's grain, or worse, labour without pay. The reeve ensured compliance. Chosen from among the peasants, he was both one of them and not. He carried authority, handed down from the steward, who answered, to the Lord's bailiff. It was his task to count sheep, weigh grain, and tally labour. He knew who shirked duties, who sold eggs without tithe, who whispered rebellion after dark. And if he failed, the lash came for him first. Peasants were not free to leave. They were bound to the manor, a phrase that sounded gentle until one tried to walk away. A man who fled might be hunted down, named fugitive, and brought back in irons. His family would suffer, his hut taken, his goods seized. There were stories of those who escaped to towns, lived as freemen, earned coin, but they were rare and told only in hush and fantasy. More often, those who ran were caught. Punishment varied by lord and by whim. Fines were common, shaming too, stocks in the village square, where others might throw dung or spoiled milk. For serious offences, a finger might be lost, or a hand. There was even talk of branding. One man, Ulrich, had tried to leave 2 winters ago. His wife had died in childbirth, and he had no children. Nothing, he said, tied him to the soil but suffering. He made it 3 villages away before he was recognised. The reeve came with 2 men, and Ulrich returned with wrists bound and eyes hollow. He never spoke again. He toiled in silence, back bent, eyes always on the ground. Marriage, too, was under the Lord's hand. A young man could not simply marry the girl he loved, not without permission. A fine had to be paid, a ceremony approved. Sometimes, the Lord required a couple to wait a year. Sometimes, he required the bride to be taken into service first. There were rumours, dark ones, that in some manors the Lord claimed the droit du seigneur, the right to sleep with a newly-wed peasant bride. Whether true or not, the fear lived in mothers' hearts. When a child was born, a tax was owed. When one died, another. Even to bury a body, one had to pay the mortuary fee, often the best cow or the finest blanket. The church called it a holy due. The villagers called it theft dressed in robes. Ewan once asked his father if anyone had ever fought back. The old man had gone quiet then, chewing on a stem of rye. They tried, he said. Long ago, before you were born. He spoke of the Great Rising, when peasants across the land had taken up staves and pitchforks, marching toward justice. They burned manors, they stormed castles, they shouted for freedom. For a season, it seemed the earth itself might shake with their fury, but it ended in fire and blood. The king, though only a boy, had promised pardon. Then, once the rebels had laid down their arms, he had them hunted, their leaders hanged, their homes burned. The message was clear. You may work, the land, bleed on it, die upon it, but you may never own it. And so, the village remembered, not in open talk, but in the eyes of elders, in the silence that fell whenever rebellion was named. Hope was dangerous. It invited ruin. Still, there were small resistances, an extra turnip hidden beneath the cloak, a handful of oats set aside before tithe, a fence post moved just far enough to claim a bit more pasture. These were the rebellions that survived, not with fire, but with cunning, not with fury, but with quiet defiance. Ewan's mother once told him, "We are not free, but we are still alive, and sometimes that's enough." But in his heart, as he walked the same paths each day, ploughed the same earth, bent beneath the same yoke, Ewan wondered if life meant more than just breathing, more than just surviving. If beyond the woods, beyond the road, there was a place where a man could wake and say, "This is mine." He didn't know, but he dreamed. The sun did not rise for the peasant. It rose for the manor. When its golden edge touched the hedgerows of Glinham Hollow, it cast long shadows over the fields that belonged not to those who worked them, but to the man who watched from his high window, if he deigned to look at all. For the peasantry, the day began with obligation. The very ground beneath their feet whispered reminders of what they owed. Labour, service, time, not to their families, not to their neighbours, but to the manor, to the Lord, whose presence loomed even in his absence. Each week, Ewan and the other peasants were required to perform what was known as week work. These were the days when their hands and backs were not their own. Mondays and Tuesdays were the Lord's to claim. Sometimes Wednesdays too, depending on the season and the manor's need. During harvest, it might become 6 days of toil, with Sunday the sole reprieve for prayers and rest, though rest often meant mending tools, cleaning or nursing wounds. And what did week work entail? It began with the bell, the cracked iron, tongue that hung from the manor gate, rung not by kindness, but by command. The villagers, regardless of hunger or sickness, would walk out to the domain, the Lord's own fields, carrying tools often older than they were. There they planted, hoed, reaped, or threshed, depending on the season. Not for pay, not for gratitude, simply because it was owed. There was no relief for age or injury. If you could stand, you could work, and if you couldn't, then someone else in your family had to stand in your place. Even the frail were not exempt. Grandfathers might be set to guard geese or chase crows from the grain. Ewan remembered one season when his father fell ill with a festering wound from a scythe blade. The reeve came the next morning. "Week work waits for no man," he said. Ewan, though just 12, took his father's place. He worked all day in silence, hands blistered by midday, arms trembling by dusk. That evening, he vomited from exhaustion. But the work was only half the burden. There were levies, obligations beyond labour. One was the boon work, demanded during times of great need, planting, haymaking, harvest. The word boon once meant favour, but in the mouths of peasants it curdled to sarcasm. These were not favours, they were summonses. Refusal brought fines, or worse. Then there were the corvée duties, obligations to help repair roads, dig ditches, or build fences. Though the roads served all, the peasants carried the stones. Even the church demanded labour, to tend its lands, to clean its yard, to repair its roof. The manor's demands extended into coin as well, though peasants rarely saw any. Rent was not always paid in money, often in produce, livestock, or service. But the lord, when in need, might impose additional taxes, a war levy if the king summoned troops, a bridge tax if the stream needed crossing, a marriage fee if a daughter wed outside the village. The worst was the heriot, the death duty. When a head of household died, the lord claimed the best beast. It mattered not that the family needed it to plough, to haul, to eat. The claim was made, and it was taken. In one bitter spring, Ewan saw a widow kneel before the steward, begging him to spare her only ox. Her husband had died weeks before, and without the animal, she could not plant. The steward, unmoved, gestured to the boy beside him. The ox was led away. That harvest, the widow's fields lay fallow. No one helped, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. If they shared too much, their own families might starve. Time itself was stolen, not only in work, but in waiting. Peasants had to present themselves at the manor for court days when disputes were settled. These were long, tedious affairs where villagers sat on wooden benches in a cold hall, waiting to be called, waiting to be fined, waiting to witness their neighbours' misfortunes. The courts settled everything, from boundary lines to accusations, of theft to disputes over hens. Justice, however, tilted like a poorly hung door. The lord or his steward acted as judge, and verdicts often favoured those who offered gifts or knew the right Latin phrases. Ewan's uncle once lost a whole strip of land because he could not read the manor roll, while his rival had memorised its every line. Literacy was a rare power, and those who had it wielded it like a blade. And still, beyond labour, beyond levies, there was expectation. Each peasant family was to maintain hedges, repair their huts, and contribute to the upkeep of the village mill where their grain was ground. But the miller, too, took a share, called a toll, which many said was larger than it ought to be. Complaints fell on deaf ears. The irony was sharp. The more a man laboured, the less he had for himself. The more he gave, the less he could spare. And yet, to resist was to invite ruin. Some whispered of distant manors where lords were kind, where boon work came with bread and ale. But these were tales, like dragons or saints. In Glenham Hollow, the system ruled without kindness, and the weight of the lord's demands pressed upon every shoulder. Even on days when there was no official work, the peasants laboured, not for the manor, but to survive. They patched their homes, tended small gardens, mended clothes, and watched for signs of illness or theft. Ewan once asked his mother why the villagers didn't simply refuse the lord's demands. She paused, stirring a pot of thin stew, then said softly, "Because the land holds our bones, lad, and he holds the land." It was not just obligation. It was a cage, beautiful in spring, when the flowers bloomed and the wheat swayed golden. But it was still a cage. A house, in the minds of those who have never known true hardship, is a refuge, a place of warmth, security, and rest. But in Glenham Hollow, a peasant's home was not a sanctuary. It was a shelter in name alone, barely more than 4 walls of wattle and daub, with a roof that whispered secrets to the rain, and a floor of packed dirt that remembered every step. The typical peasant dwelling stood low and crooked, nestled in thickets of nettle and wild grass, its thatch roof sagging under years of patchwork and storms. The scent of smoke and damp earth was ever present. There were no chimneys, only a smoke hole in the roof, which often failed to draw, leaving the air inside dense and acrid. Eyes watered, throats rasped, The smoke clung to hair, to clothing, to the very soul. Ewan's home was like all others in the village, a single room, shared by all. Privacy was a luxury for those who could afford silence and separate chambers. In the hollow, you lived shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling with breath, sweat with sweat, sorrow with sorrow. The walls, built from woven hazel branches plastered with mud, cracked each winter and needed constant tending. Rain seeped in, insects burrowed, cold pressed through like a thief. Repairs were done with bare hands and borrowed time, usually on Sundays or before dawn, when work on the manor fields was paused. Furniture was sparse. A rough-hewn bench, a low table with a wobble, straw mats for sleeping, perhaps a chest to store what few possessions they had, cloth scraps, dried herbs, or a wooden bowl passed through generations. Tools were hung on pegs beside the hearth. Everything was used until it broke, and then repurposed again. The hearth was the heart of the home, though its fire rarely roared. Wood was scarce. Most families burned dried dung or bramble twigs. A good flame was saved for stewing, and even that was done slowly. Food simmered all day to soften roots too tough to chew. Ash was swept out with care, for every ember had value. Above, the fire hung a cauldron, blackened with age and stories. Into it went whatever could be found, leeks, onions, barley if fortune allowed, and water thickened with oat flour, sometimes a bone, sometimes wild greens. Meat was rare and always a reason for hushed gratitude. Meals were eaten with wooden spoons from a shared bowl. Hands were wiped on tunics. Children fought for crusts. There was no tablecloth, no salt dish, no second servings. Hunger dictated the pace. The roof space was not empty. Smoke curled upward and lingered there, darkening the rafters and driving away insects. At least, some of them. Often, smoked meat would hang if a family had been lucky enough to trap a rabbit or squirrel. But in most homes, it was the domain of spiders and rats. Bedding was simple, sacks stuffed with straw, sometimes mixed with rushes or dried leaves. They smelled of earth, sweat, and old mould. Blankets, if present, were coarse and patched. In the depths of winter, the family slept huddled together for warmth, arms curled around bellies, feet tangled with siblings, the youngest tucked deep, in the centre, shielded by older bodies. Every creak of the timbers was familiar. Every drip from the roof, every groan of wind through the chinks. But familiarity did not breed comfort. At night, fear crept in with the cold. Ewan had once seen a wolf pacing at the edge of the village. Its eyes glinted like polished stone. Though they seldom attacked, the threat was real. Chickens vanished, a piglet once taken. And in darkness, every snapping twig could be a beast, or worse, a thief. Doors were seldom locked, for they had no locks. A plank propped across the frame was the only barrier. Windows, when present, were holes covered by oiled cloth or thin horn. Light was a luxury, and so was glass. Inside, the sounds of life never ceased. A baby's whimper, a cough that grew deeper, the shifting of a mother feeding in the dark, the whispered prayers of the old woman who feared not waking. There was no bathroom. Waste was carried out in pots, emptied into middens behind the huts. In summer, the stench was unbearable. In winter, the chill made it worse. Flies bred there. Disease clung to the edges. Still, it was home. Here, children were born, teeth clenched against pain. Here, love bloomed in small moments. A father smoothing a child's hair, a mother singing softly while stirring broth. Here, life unfolded in quiet courage, day after day. Ewan's favourite part of the house was the southern wall, where a little patch of sunlight warmed the earth in late spring. He liked to lie there when he could, feeling the warmth seep through his threadbare tunic. It reminded him that the world, though cruel, still turned. That seasons changed, that even under the weight of mud and labour, the sun still found a way in. Sometimes he dreamed of stone houses, of chimneys and beds, of candles that did not gutter in wind. He imagined a room with shelves, with bread that stayed fresh, with a door that closed tightly. But then the wind would whistle through the rafters, a rat would scrabble across the beams, and the dream would fade into the smoke. The house was no fortress. It offered little protection from storm or sorrow. But within those cracked walls, life persisted, and sometimes that was enough. The land was never still. Beneath the peasant's feet, it breathed in slow, ponderous rhythm, guided not by comfort or convenience, but by the turning of the seasons. In Glinham Hollow, time did not come in minutes or hours, but in furrows, frost, and flowering buds. Each season brought its own demands, and the cycle was relentless, unyielding, and cruelly precise. To be a peasant was to live at the mercy of this great wheel. Spring began not with flowers, but with aching backs. As soon as the frost loosened its grip on the earth, the work began in earnest. The fields needed ploughing, seed needed sowing, ditches cleared, fences repaired. Every hand was needed. Man, woman, child. Sleep grew short. The mornings were crisp, and the air stung with the dampness of thawing soil. Ewan remembered the feel of a wooden plough handle, rough and splintered beneath his fingers. The oxen, slow and stubborn, trudged forward under the sharp cries of his father. Behind them, the earth turned, dark and rich, but heavy. A single acre could take days to prepare, and each step threatened to sink a foot in mud. The seeds, rye or barley mostly, were cast by hand. There was a rhythm to it, a long arcing sweep, a silent prayer that rain would come when needed, not too soon, not too strong. A dry spring meant a poor yield. A wet one could rot the seed before it took root. Spring was also the time of hunger's shadow. The winter stores, if not already gone, were nearly spent. Bread became thinner. Stew became water. Many peasants survived on what little grew wild. Nettles, dock, and early mushrooms. Children scavenged along hedgerows. The promise of summer did little to still the rumble of empty bellies. Then came summer, when the fields stood tall and green, the world briefly lush and gold-touched, but there was no rest in beauty. It was the season of haymaking, of constant motion. The scythe was never idle. Grass needed cutting, turning and stacking before rain could ruin it. The sun bore down relentlessly. Skin blistered, hands bled. Ewan remembered his first hayfield, how the sun made waves of green shimmer like the sea. But after hours of cutting, his arms ached so fiercely he cried into the hay when no one was looking. His mother tied nettle-stung rags around his wrists and told him to keep going. "The grass waits for no soul," she'd said, and she was right. The mid-year months were also a time of chores too numerous to count. Animals needed pasturing. Thatched roofs required patching. Weeds had to be kept at bay. Tools sharpened. Water carried. Every moment of daylight was precious. Evenings were short, and by firelight there was still spinning, mending, drying herbs, or sorting beans. By late summer, the barley began to ripen. The golden heads swayed in the wind, and the village held its breath. Any storm, any freak hail, could ruin everything. And then, when the time was right, the harvest began. This was the most sacred of labours, and the most exhausting. All hands turned to the field. The manor's grain had to be reaped first, always. This meant long days of back-breaking toil with sickles and flails, each stalk cut by hand, bundled and stacked. Boon work was demanded, and no refusal was tolerated. The harvest feast, when it came, was brief. A single night of ale, of bread thicker than usual, perhaps even meat. Laughter, music if someone had a whistle or drum. But behind every cheer lay the fear. Would this year's yield carry them through winter? Autumn brought the threshing, the hard rhythmic beating of grain from stalk. Dust filled the air, stung eyes and stuck to skin. Then came winnowing, tossing grain into the wind to separate the chaff. It was precise, repetitive and vital. The last crops were dug: onions, leeks, turnips. Apples gathered, beans dried, chickens culled. Each act was a gamble against what winter would demand, and then the year turned cold. Winter was not a silent season. It howled. It crept into every crack of the peasant's world, turned water to ice, froze breath in air, and dulled. The edge of strength. Days were short, nights long and unforgiving. Work never ceased, even then. Animals had to be fed, tools repaired, wood chopped. Snow had to be cleared from paths. But winter's true cruelty was in its stillness. There were no fresh vegetables, no milk if the cow dried up, no warmth if the wood ran out. The children became pale. Coughs echoed in the huts. The sick lay longer near the fire, and the old became quieter, more distant. Death came softly in winter, not with a scream, but with a long sigh. And yet even in winter, preparation began anew. Seeds were checked, grain measured. Repairs were started indoors. The cycle loomed again, just beyond the cold horizon. To a peasant, the year was not a calendar, but a set of labours and fears. There were no holidays as we know them, only feast days imposed by the church or moments stolen between exhaustion. The solstices came and went without candles. The first frost was not poetic, it was a warning. The rhythm was inescapable, and yet, within this wheel, life endured. Babies were born, even in the dark of December. Laughter sometimes danced in spring breezes. Love bloomed in a glance over, a shared rake or a bowl of soup. But these were fleeting. The land demanded always. The seasons turned, without pause, and the peasants turned with them. In the lives of Glenham Hollow's peasants, the church stood like a stone anchor in the soil, vast, immovable, and heavy. It was at once a sanctuary and a cage, a place of hope and a house of warning. It loomed not only in the centre of the Hay village, but in every corner of a peasant's soul, whispering of heaven, murmuring of hell, and echoing with Latin words few could understand. On Sundays, the toll of the bell beckoned the villagers like sheep to pen. Wrapped in worn cloaks, heads bowed low against the wind or rain, they walked the rutted path to the chapel. It was a squat structure of rough-hewn stone and oak beams, its roof patched with straw and old prayers. Inside, it was dim, light filtered through small slits in the wall, and the air smelled of damp wool and candle wax. The priest, Father Godric, stood at the front, his robes once white, now faded to grey. His was not a gentle voice. It rang clear and stern, shaped by years of repeating, the same sermons to tired ears. He spoke of obedience, of duty, of suffering as the path to salvation, of humility, of hell. The villagers listened in silence, not out of reverence, but out of fear. Most of the Mass was spoken in Latin, a language none of them knew. They knelt when told, muttered Amen when the priest paused, and crossed themselves more, out of habit than comprehension. Religion, for them, was not a choice. It was a duty, as inescapable as the turning of the seasons. The church taught that God placed everyone in their rightful place. Kings ruled by divine right, lords by noble blood, and peasants, well, they laboured because it was the will of heaven. To question that was heresy. To defy it was rebellion against not only the manor, but against God himself. The promise of heaven was dangled before them like a distant star, bright, unreachable. Suffer well, Father Godric would say, and your reward shall be eternal. But eternity was a long way off, and the suffering was very near. Still, the church touched every aspect of life. A child could not be born without baptism. A couple could not marry without the priest's blessing. The dead could not rest without his final rites. To fall out of favor with the church was to risk not only spiritual doom, but social death. Excommunication meant shunning, isolation, fear, and the church demanded more than prayers. There was the tithe, a tenth of every harvest, every chicken, every pence earned if there was coin. Even the poorest were expected to give. The granary beside the chapel stood fuller than most of the villagers' pantries. It was said to be for the poor, for the hungry, for God's work. But few ever saw that grain again. And there were holy days, dozens of them. While these brought relief from manor labor, they still required attendance, rituals, and offerings. Some were somber. Lent, when meat was forbidden and fasting imposed. Others, like Easter or Michaelmas, were celebrated, with extra loaves or a shared roasted bird if the harvest had been kind. The church also held control over knowledge. Only the priest could read. Only he held the books, manuscripts of parchment, kept locked in a chest. The Bible itself was chained to the altar. Tales from it were read aloud, interpreted as the priest saw fit. To question was dangerous. To possess a written word without permission was unthinkable. Still, there was comfort in ritual. Ewan remembered the sound of chant, echoing softly through the chapel on cold mornings. The low rhythm of voices, joined in song, held a strange power. Even if the words were unknown, the cadence soothed. And in the flickering light of candles, the shadows on the stone walls felt less like burdens, more like memories. But alongside peace came fear. The church spoke often of sin, not just in action, but in thought. To covet, to doubt, to curse beneath one's breath, these were enough to stain the soul. Confession was encouraged, though always to the priest, and never in true privacy. Punishment could be penance or a public rebuke, sometimes both. There were tales, whispers passed from village to village, of witches burned, of heretics hanged. These were far-off horrors, yet they took root in the villagers' minds. A crooked old woman with too many herbs might be feared as a witch. A man who dreamed of freedom might be branded a blasphemer. Even illness could be seen as divine punishment. When the cough lingered, when the child failed to thrive, villagers searched their souls and the sins of others. Sometimes, the afflicted were blamed for their own suffering. Sometimes, the scapegoat was chosen, and mercy disappeared beneath suspicion. And yet, they clung to faith, because it was all they had. When Ewan's brother had died, the priest had stood over the tiny grave, speaking of angels and mercy. Ewan did not understand the words, but the cadence, the solemn tone, had stayed with him. It gave shape to the grief. It wrapped sorrow in ceremony, gave it a place to rest. In the dark, by the hearth, when fear crept in with the cold, it was prayer that steadied the mind, even if whispered without belief, even if only to chase the silence. Peasants lived between two tyrannies, the Lord who ruled their land and the church that ruled their souls. But of the two, the church reached further, into birth, into death, into dreams. It offered salvation, but demanded obedience. It soothed, but it also watched. And always, it reminded them, this is your lot. This is God's will. They bowed. They crossed themselves, and they endured. The edge of Glinham Hollow was not marked by fence or wall, but by trees, tall, brooding, and ancient. The forest stood like a line of quiet sentinels, their branches weaving a thick canopy of shadow and silence. To the peasants, this was not a place of peace or wonder. The woods were wild, they were dangerous, and in many ways, they were forbidden. Ewan often stood at the tree line, staring into the shifting light, imagining what might lie beyond the first bend. Stories spoke of beasts, spirits and men who had turned away from society, poachers, outlaws, and worse. The forest whispered, and the villagers listened with wary ears. By law, the forest belonged to the king. It was part of the royal forest, a term that did not imply thick trees so much as sovereign ownership. No one could hunt there without a license. No one could chop its trees without consent. And even gathering firewood was a gamble. And yet, they went, not openly, and never in groups, but in pairs or alone, beneath the grey dawn or moonless dark. They foraged for mushrooms, berries, herbs, anything that might fill a bowl or treat an illness. They watched for signs of deer, though hunting them was a crime. To be caught with venison was to risk maiming or death. Poaching was not romantic, it was survival. Ewan remembered when Tamsin, the baker's daughter, returned one morning with blood on her skirts and her brother limping beside her. They had found a hare caught in an old snare, a trap likely set years ago by a long-dead poacher. They took it. A reeve from a nearby manor spotted them. He threw a stone and chased them, but they escaped. That night, they ate in silence. The meat was shared with neighbours, cooked in haste, bones buried deep. Word spread in hushed thanks, but none boasted. The fear of being reported lingered. The forest itself held natural dangers as well. Wolves roamed its deeper reaches, mostly, shy but hungry in winter. Boars were more dangerous, bigger, faster and bristling with tusks. A startled sow could maim or kill. Then there were the stories. Every village had them. In Glenham Hollow, the tales spoke of the Hollow Men, figures made of bark and bone, who wandered the woods in search of those who trespassed. Some said they were the spirits of trees felled without permission. Others whispered they were peasants, who had died in the forest, angry and lost. Ewan did not know what he believed, but he remembered the day Aelith, the wise woman, took him into the woods to gather mugwort and wild thyme. Her movements were precise, her silence unshakable. She walked with reverence, muttering to herself as she plucked leaves and filled her satchel. "Speak softly," she told him, her voice low. "The forest listens." He asked once later what she had meant. She only looked at him and said, "Some places remember pain." There were other legends too, a well hidden deep among the trees that granted visions, but at a terrible cost. A hollow stump that whispered your death if you placed your ear to it. Lights that floated between trunks, leading lost travelers astray. Most dismissed these as stories for children, but few risked testing them. The trees also sheltered those who had no home, outlaws, men who had broken laws, whether justly or not, sometimes built camps within the woods, smokeless fires, canvas draped over branches. These men lived outside the manor's reach, hunted by sheriffs and feared by villagers. Some were thieves, others merely desperate. Once, a man named Bran came to Glenham Hollow under cover of rain. He wore rags but carried a knife. He asked for bread, and the miller's wife gave him a crust. That night, the mill's door was found open, and 2 sacks of barley were gone. Whether it was Bran or not, none dared pursue him. The forest protected its own. Despite its perils, the woods were essential. Children gathered firewood there. Women picked blackberries in August, wild garlic in spring. The men carved handles from fallen branches, cut reeds to patch roofs, always with eyes over their shoulders, always with silence. For even if no spirits dwelled within, there was still the law. The foresters, men sworn to protect the king's land, were ruthless. If they found a peasant with a bow, or even with too much wood, fines were levied. If they found game being skinned, the punishment could be cruel. Branding, imprisonment. In rare cases, hanging. And yet, hunger pushed feet back into the trees. Again and again, Ewan once followed his father on such a journey. They left before first light, slipping past the edge of the village, walking until the branches closed in around them. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and old leaves. They spoke only twice. Once when his father showed him how to spot rabbit trails, and again when they found one, they didn't catch anything. But Ewan never forgot the sound of the wind through the trees, or the way his father touched the bark of a fallen oak, as though asking forgiveness. The forest was not evil. It was simply indifferent, beautiful and brutal, generous and unforgiving. It gave, but never without cost. When they returned to the village, empty-handed but unharmed, Ewan's mother embraced them as if they had survived battle. And perhaps, in some way, they had. The woods would remain, long after lords changed and kings died, long after huts fell and names were forgotten, and the peasants, those who dared enter, would keep listening to its whispers. For all its toil and hardship, the life of a peasant in Glenham Hollow carried a fragile rhythm, a brittle kind of balance that, when not shattered by lords or weather, held just long enough to get by. But disaster was never far. It waited like a wolf at the tree line. When it came, it did not knock gently. It kicked the door in and tore through the village with no warning, no mercy. The two greatest fears in any peasant's heart were fire and famine. Both could begin in silence. Both could end lives by the dozen. Fire, though rare, was devastating. The peasant homes were dry in summer, patched with straw and thatch. Walls of wattle and daub burned easily when the wind was high. A single spark. From the hearth, a dropped ember, an overturned lantern, could ignite a hut in seconds, and when one caught fire, the next was soon ablaze. There was no fire brigade, no buckets ready, no river nearby to draw from in haste. Water had to be fetched in pails from the village well. By the time the alarm was raised, flames had usually taken hold. Ewan remembered the fire well. He was 9. It was mid-autumn, the air crisp, leaves turning. Old Myrta, the Reeves' widow, had fallen asleep with her cauldron too close to the coals. The pot overturned. Sparks danced like demons. Her cries woke the village. They tried to form a line to the well, but it was chaos. Children screamed. Chickens ran wild. Smoke choked the lungs. Ewan's father doused their roof with buckets, hands blistered and shaking. Others threw dirt. Some prayed. In the end, 3 huts were lost. Myrta died, overcome by smoke before anyone could reach her. The fire had spread faster than breath. That night, the villagers huddled under the stars, wrapped in cloaks, the scent of ash clinging to their hair. The next day, work resumed. The ashes cooled, but no time was given for mourning. Those whose homes had been spared took in the displaced, and by week's end, the process of rebuilding had begun. But some never truly recovered. Possessions, few though they were, had turned to cinders. Blankets, tools, heirlooms, all gone. Famine, however, was a slower beast. It crept. A poor harvest did not shout. It whispered. First came the rain, too early, too often. The fields flooded, seeds drowned. Then came a spring with no sun. Crops barely grew, thin and weak. The barley turned, yellow instead of gold. The turnips shriveled. The beans gave up. In such years, the manor still demanded its share. The tithe still went to the church. The peasants were left with less than little. That winter, they stretched what grain they had with ground bark and crushed acorns. The bread turned bitter, hard as stone. Pottage became watery dreams of food. Rats grew bold. Cats, when they could be caught, disappeared into the stew pot. Children's cheeks grew hollow. Their limbs thinned. The oldest often gave up their meals. Grandfathers wasted away quietly. Mothers wept while pretending to eat. Ewan's family survived the great famine of that year, but barely. His sister, barely 5, fell ill and never rose again. She was buried with no shroud, only wrapped in her father's cloak, the one he had worn since Ewan could remember. He never wore it again. In famine, rules changed. Theft increased, not out of greed, but desperation. Chickens vanished. A stored onion could disappear. Accusations flew. Friendships cracked. Trust wore thin. The manor punished harshly. The stocks were used often. A man named Harl was caught stealing turnips from the Lord's storehouse. He was whipped in the square, 10 lashes while the village was made to watch. It was not justice. It was a warning. Some tried to leave, to find food in distant towns, to beg along the roads, but those were dangerous paths. Bandits roamed. Town gates were closed to strangers in times of hunger. Disease travelled easily with the starved. One woman, Alna, had walked 3 days to reach a priory rumoured to give bread. She returned weeks later, thinner than bone, with a crust of black bread and no words in her mouth. Her husband had died while she was gone, and yet even famine could be worse. Sometimes it came with disease. Malnutrition weakened bodies. Coughs turned to fevers. Boils appeared. The priest could offer only prayer. Aelith, the wise woman, brewed teas that no longer worked. The air smelled of sickness. The moans of the dying carried through the village like a cruel hymn. The graveyard swelled. In the worst years, the dead outnumbered the living. Burials were hurried. Graves dug shallow, names sometimes forgotten. And after the famine passed, if it did, the scars remained. A generation thinned. Children who would never grow. Elders whose eyes looked hollow for years. The land eventually would recover. Fields could be reseeded. Tools could be remade. Huts rebuilt. But the people, they carried the famine inside them, like ghosts in the bones. Even years later, when the harvest was good, peasants would store every crust. Every bone was boiled twice. Every seed counted. Hunger, once known, never truly left. Ewan learned early that disaster was not an occasional guest. It was a companion, a shape in the corner of the room, a weight on the edge of the table. It taught him not to waste. It taught him not to hope too much. It taught him that peace was a brief silence before the storm. Childhood, for those born in Glinham Hollow, was not an age of wonder or play, but rather a brief, bone-thin window between birth and burden. It passed like a morning mist, evaporating before noon, burned away by labour and expectation. There were no toys, no tutors, no idle afternoons filled with questions and discovery. To be a child among peasants was to learn early that life was work and rest was rare. The moment a child could walk and carry a pail without stumbling, their usefulness was measured. Their place in the household was no longer nestled between arms, but among the ranks of the labouring. Ewan's earliest memory was not of a game or a gentle lullaby, but of mud. Thick, sucking mud that clung to his bare legs as he followed his older brother to the stream to fetch water. The bucket was too heavy. He spilled half. He cried. His brother cuffed his ear, not out of cruelty, but because their mother had asked for that water, and it was already nearly dark. By 5, children were expected to contribute. Girls helped in the garden, carried kindling, and learned to spin and weave by candlelight. Boys chased birds from crops, scared foxes from coops, and ran errands to the manor or the mill. No one asked if they were tired. That was the world. To tire was to live. Some games did exist, but they were brief and built from necessity. Stones were tossed and caught. Sticks became swords. In spring, when nettles were tender, children dared one another to walk through them barefoot without wincing. They laughed, yes, but even laughter was hushed if the Lord's steward passed nearby. Schooling was not for them. The village had no teacher, and books were locked away in the priest's chambers. A child might learn to count by watching grain measured at the mill, or learn the seasons by planting, but letters were the marks of monks and nobles. Father Godric had once taken Ewan to the chapel to sweep the floors. As he worked, he saw the priest writing on a scrap of parchment, his hand gliding over the surface with calm precision. The symbols meant nothing to Ewan, but he watched, mesmerized. When he asked what it said, the priest only smiled and said, "Words not meant for your tongue." That was the end of it. In winter, when the fields lay dormant, children remained busy. They twisted cord, helped clean fish, sorted dried herbs. Girls mended tears in rough cloth. Boys carved steaks or helped trap rabbits. And always, they listened to elders, to stories, to orders. The hierarchy of age was clear and sharp. Punishment was swift. A slap for insolence, a strap for laziness. Children were not coddled, for their survival depended on obedience. A mistake in the field could cost the family a row of barley. A broken tool might mean a day without bread. And yet, there were moments of softness. On certain nights, when the fire burned steady and the wind rattled only gently at the shutters, mothers told stories, old tales of saints and spirits, of green men and ghost hounds, of brave peasants who tricked greedy lords. The children listened wide-eyed, hearts full, minds wandering far beyond the village hedge. Sometimes they dreamt. Ewan once dreamt he could fly. Over the manor, over the hills, to a place where the earth was soft and the skies wide and blue. But when he awoke, the roof still dripped, and the floor was still cold. Festivals were the rare delight. At midsummer or Michaelmas, there might be a game of blind man's buff, or a mock fight with wooden swords. Boys painted their faces with ash. Girls wove garlands from daisies and long grass. The priest warned against too much revelry, but even he allowed a little cheer. For if children did not laugh then, when would they? But even festivals came with their own dangers. Ewan remembered one May Day when a boy climbed the old oak for a better view of the dancers. The branch cracked. He fell hard. His leg twisted beneath him like a crooked stick. It never healed straight. He limped forever after and was deemed slow by the manor. His family received less grain. He did less work. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. The fall had stolen not just his laughter, but his usefulness. In such a world, growing up was not a journey. It was a narrowing. Girls by 12 were seen as ready for betrothal. By 14, many were mothers. Their days became a cycle of swaddling, sweeping, stirring, and surviving. Boys, if strong, became workers. If clever, they might assist the reeve, or even become his apprentice. But most remained in the fields, pushing ploughs and carrying sacks. As their fathers had, freedom was a concept too large for young minds, but fairness that they understood. When Ewan was 10, he watched a noble boy ride through the village on a pony, clad in velvet, a feather in his cap. The boy was younger than Ewan, but already spoke French and carried a dagger. He did not look at the peasants. He did not need to. Ewan stared until the pony disappeared into the mist. He said nothing, but something inside him shifted. A quiet question, not yet rebellion, but not yet silence. Childhood, for peasants, was not an age. It was a task, a race to grow sturdy, obedient, and silent. Those who succeeded became men and women with bent backs and quiet eyes. Those who didn't were forgotten. And yet, even under this weight, children sometimes ran through the fields with arms outstretched. They splashed in puddles, sang out, of tune, and told each other stories of hidden treasure buried beneath the old yew. Because even the poorest child, beneath the dirt and duty, carried a seed of something defiant, something like joy. There was a place in Glinham Hollow where stone sang and grain met fate, a place where the air was thick with flower dust and grievance. The village mill. It stood beside the slow-turning stream, squat and grey, its great wooden wheel creaking, with every gust of water's force. To the peasants, the mill was both lifeline and leash. For in a land where bread was survival, the mill held dominion over all. No family could grind their own grain. That right belonged exclusively to the lord, who, through the ancient law of soak, commanded that all peasant-grown grain be brought to his mill and his mill alone. To break this rule was to defy feudal order, and the punishment, though not always immediate, could be harsh and public. The miller, a thick-set man named Bioka, wielded more power than most. Though not noble, he was the steward of the grain, the gatekeeper to the bread of life. His word, when it came to weights, measures, and tolls, was rarely questioned. Ewan had always viewed the mill as a place of quiet threat. Inside, the air was loud with the rhythm of the grindstones, two massive circular slabs that turned endlessly, rumbling as they reduced golden sheaves into pale powder. The scent was not unpleasant, but it clung to everything. Hair, skin, even breath. Every time Ewan entered with his father, the fine white dust settled into his eyelashes like frost. The peasants would come in turns, each with their sacks of grain. Barley, rye, sometimes oats. Wheat, if one was lucky or blessed by trade. They stood in line, speaking little, nodding to one another, eyes wary. When it was your turn, Bioka would heft the sack, examine its weight, then pour it into the hopper. The stones did their work, groaning softly, and the flour spilled out below into a new sack. But not all of it. The miller took his toll. It was the custom, 1 in every 16 parts, though many suspected Bioka took more. No one could measure it exactly, and the law offered little recourse. The toll was part of the system, like the tithe to the church, or the labour owed to the manor. Questioning it marked you as difficult, perhaps even dangerous. Bioka defended his share with ritual. He kept old wooden scoops of various sizes, polished smooth from use. He claimed precision, claimed fairness, but always his scoop seemed larger when the harvest was poor, and smaller when the Lord's men came to check. Rumours of cheating echoed through the village, but quietly. Too many had reason to fear retaliation. The miller's favour could mean a slightly heavier return. His displeasure could bring delay, or worse, accusations of theft. Ewan remembered once when a man named Coleman, a widower with 3 small children, spoke too boldly about the weight of his flour sack being light. The next week, Bioka claimed Coleman's grain had a worm smell and refused to grind it. By the time the reeve intervened, Coleman's grain had spoiled in storage. That winter, 2 of his children died. The villagers understood the message. Still, the mill was a place of congregation, not joyous like a festival, but practical. News passed here. Hired work might be offered. A new birth announced. A theft whispered about. The stones turned, and life revolved with them. Children were often tasked with carrying smaller sacks. They waited at the doorway, eyes wide, watching the wheel turn and the flour puff out like breath from the earth itself. Sometimes Bioka tossed them crumbs of bread, hardened and dry, but welcomed nonetheless. Other times he shouted them away with a scowl. There were stories, always stories, of millers who ground more than grain. One tale spoke of a miller in the next shire who had hidden silver in his flour sacks and was dragged off by the sheriffs, men. Another told of a mill cursed by a monk, where no grain ever ground true again. Some whispered the wheel would turn even when the stream ran dry, fed by something darker beneath. Superstition wrapped itself tightly around the grinding stones. Some said never to speak ill inside the mill, for it could carry your words and twist them. Others claimed that if you listened to the wheel long enough, it would whisper your fate. Ewan never listened for long. He feared what he might hear. The mill also served the manor, grinding the Lord's grain before all others. That flour was cleaner, finer. It was stored in locked chests, measured with iron scales. Bioka's demeanour changed when handling it. He moved with reverence, spoke less, and sometimes sang low chants that no peasant recognized. Even the rats knew the difference. They swarmed the peasants' sacks at night, but never touched the Lord's store. It was a strange thing, to know that the same grain, when passed through the same stones, could carry such different weight in the world. The flour in Ewan's, home baked into rough, dark loaves, dense and dry. The Lord's bread, he was told, was white and soft as lamb's wool. Sometimes, Ewan wondered what it might taste like, not just once, but every day. He never said it aloud, and still, the mill turned. In spring, when the first grains were milled, the villagers lined up with cautious hope. In autumn, they came bowed with worry, knowing that this flour must last. The cold, In winter, the mill stood still, waiting for new harvest, its wheel frozen in place like a monument to patience. It was not just a building. It was the heartbeat of peasant life, slow, grinding, and indifferent. And for all its dust and rhythm, it gave little mercy. He was not a knight, not a lord, nor even a squire. He did not own land, nor wear a sword. And yet, in Glenham Hollow, few men were feared more than the reeve. His name was Dunstan. His face was creased like the bark of an old oak, and his eyes seemed never to blink. He walked with a limp, though no one could remember when or how he'd been injured. Some said he was born crooked. Others whispered that the Lord himself had broken him long ago and remade him into something useful. But one thing was certain. Dunstan remembered everything. He remembered how many pigs each family owned. He remembered who missed their week work in August, who borrowed a spade without asking, who muttered beneath their breath at church. He knew the precise width of every tenant's strip of land and how many eggs they were likely to gather from their hens each week. He was, in essence, the Lord's eyes and ears in the village, and his arm as well. Appointed from among the peasants, the reeve lived a strange life, caught between two worlds. Once a farmer like the rest, now elevated but isolated. His hut was slightly larger, his coat slightly warmer, and his word carried weight, but his neighbours looked at him with thin smiles and wary hearts. Dunstan had once been Ewan's father's friend, long ago, when they were boys. They'd played at chasing frogs and building toy carts from sticks. But that bond had frayed with the years, and when Dunstan had accepted the reeve's staff, a carved rod marked with the manor's sigil, the final thread was cut. The reeve's duties were many. He ensured the manor's fields were ploughed and planted. He oversaw harvest quotas. He settled disputes over borders and livestock. He tallied labour owed and labour given. But more than all that, he ensured obedience. If a peasant neglected his boon work, Dunstan would note it in the manor roll. If a child skipped Sunday service, he'd report it to Father Godric. If someone dared speak against the Lord, even in the softest whisper, Dunstan found a way to hear it. He had informants, of course. Not official ones, but desperate ones. Men and women who traded secrets for favours, a better strip of land, an overlooked fine. Everyone knew it, though none said it aloud. It was said that Dunstan could smell guilt, that his eyes could see through thatch and wall. In truth, it was simply vigilance. He watched, he listened, he remembered, and when he judged, the village followed. Ewan had seen him settle a dispute over a wandering goat. 2 women claimed it, each insisting it was theirs. Dunstan examined the beast, listened in silence, then turned and gave it to the one who had helped gather the manor's hay the previous week. No explanation, just a nod. Injustice? Perhaps, but none dared question it. Punishment under Dunstan was swift and public. The stock stood near the chapel, a low platform of wood with iron rings for wrists and ankles. Those placed within it sat exposed, rain or sun, jeered at by children, pitied by few. The shame of it clung for months afterward. Fines were worse in some ways. The reeve could set them for a range of offences: missing labour, lying, quarrelling, minor theft. The silver or grain owed was often more than a family could spare. And so, debts grew. Sometimes, a man's tools were taken. Sometimes, a goat. Once, a youth named Elric had carved his name into the side of the well, a simple act of pride. Dunstan had seen it the next morning. Elric spent 2 days in the stocks and had to scrape the carving off with a dull knife, bloodying his hands in the process. He never carved again. And yet, Dunstan was not a monster. He allowed Aelith, the wise woman, to continue her healing, though others might have charged her with witchcraft. He made sure orphans were assigned a place to sleep after their parents died of fever. He once paid, from his own grain, for a widow's tithe when she had nothing left to give. But these moments were rare, quiet, and never mentioned. They did not erase the shadow he cast. Some believed he hated the peasants he ruled. Others believed he loved them too much to let them fall apart. Ewan was never sure. What he knew was that Dunstan had no joy in his work. He walked like a man bound to an unending sentence. The reeve was required to attend the manorial court, held monthly at the manor hall. There he stood beside the steward, presenting lists, resolving minor legal matters, handing out punishments. The lords came and went. The stewards sometimes changed. But Dunstan remained. He never drank. He never danced. At festivals he watched, arms crossed. It was said his wife had died in childbirth years ago, that they'd been deeply in love. He never remarried. To the children, he was a figure of dread. They called him Old Owl for his silent stare. They scattered when he approached. And yet, now and then, he would leave a small bundle of firewood on a doorstep or a single apple on a windowsill. No one saw him do it. No one spoke of it. He was part of the village, but not of it. A reminder of the balance they all walked, the line between order and despair, between punishment and survival. Ewan once asked his father why Dunstan took the job. His father, quiet for a long time, finally said, "Because someone had to." And perhaps that was true. In a world where chaos always threatened, someone had to remember the rules. Someone had to wield the rod, even if it meant walking alone. In Glinham Hollow, the dawn did not break first for the plough or the priest, but for the women. They rose before the cock crowed, hands already reaching in the dark for woolen cloaks and wooden buckets. While their husbands and sons still wrestled with dreams, the women were already at work, stoking the fire, kneading rough dough, checking the coals. The burdens they carried were not shouted or sworn about. They were worn in silence, stitched into skin and soul alike. To be a peasant woman in Dark Age Britain was to be doubly shackled, once by the land, and again by the laws of man and God. From girlhood, the path was marked. There was no courtship, no slow discovery of self. A girl was taught to obey, to mend, to gather herbs, to pluck feathers clean, to fold herself into usefulness. By the time her body began to bleed, she was watched for signs of readiness. A glance from a reeve, a word from the priest, a nod from the father. Marriage was not always a choice. Often it was arrangement, a way to merge land strips, settle debts, strengthen kinship bonds. If the lord approved and the fee was paid, the union was sealed. The girl, perhaps 13, maybe younger, became wife, then mother, almost in the same breath. Childbirth was expected, frequent, dangerous. There were no midwives trained by books, no potions, but those brewed by women like Aelith from Roots and Hope. A woman gave birth on a bed of straw, sometimes with another holding her hand, sometimes alone, while others worked in the fields, unaware that new life, or death, was entering the hut. For many, it was both. Maternal death was common. So too, the deaths of infants before they ever tasted bread. It was said that for every 3 children born, only 1 might live to see 10 summers. And yet, the expectations never changed. Women bore the brunt of the home, cooking, cleaning, spinning, wool, patching clothes, raising children, tending gardens, milking goats, feeding hens, gathering herbs, sweeping soot, and whispering prayers into smoke. They worked as hard as any man, often harder. They rose before dawn and retired after all. Others had laid down. They aged quickly, not just in body, but in spirit. The light in their eyes dimmed from constant strain, from too much grief and too little rest. And in spite of it all, they endured. Ewan remembered his mother, Mara, always moving. Her hands were rarely still. If she wasn't stirring a pot, she was darning a sock, plucking burrs from the dog's coat, or walking to the well with a bucket in each hand. She spoke little, laughed less. But in her silence was strength. She once mended the fence after a storm, splinter by splinter, with only a knife and a strip of cloth to bind the broken post. She set bones. She pulled teeth. She laid her own child in the grave and went back to milking the cow 2 days later. And she never once asked for thanks. The church had its own views on womanhood. Women were Eve's daughters, capable of piety, yes, but also prone to sin, to temptation, to weakness. Father Godric preached that a virtuous woman was obedient, modest, fertile. Her silence was her virtue, her suffering a holy trial. On Sundays, the women sat apart from the men in the chapel, eyes lowered, heads covered. They sang softly when permitted, but their place was clear. Some women resisted, in small ways. A laugh too loud, a dress with colour too bright, a refusal to wed the chosen man. These acts were met with whispers, disapproval, sometimes even accusations. Witch was a word that hovered, rarely spoken aloud, but always waiting like smoke behind a door. Aelith, the wise woman, walked that line daily. Her knowledge of herbs, her refusal to marry, her comfort with silence. It all made her suspect. But she had saved too many lives to be cast out. She existed because the village needed her. Many women feared becoming like her. Others admired her in secret. Motherhood was not only a role, it was identity. A childless woman was pitied, sometimes mocked. A widow without children often fell to ruin unless taken in by kin. But those with too many children suffered just the same, stretched thin between mouths and chores. And yet, in their own quiet spaces, the women carved joy. They sang while spinning wool. They whispered stories to their babies. They made necklaces from berries, baked sweet cakes of honey and oats on feast days. They plucked flowers and placed them behind one another's ears, laughing like girls again for a heartbeat. They formed the hidden heart of the village. They were the keepers of names and the teachers of customs. It was they who remembered who owed what to whom, who was born in a storm, who had seen ghosts by the mill. They knew which herbs soothed stomachs and which helped a woman wait a little longer between children. They passed down knowledge in calloused hands and quiet instruction, not written in any book, but pressed like a fingerprint into the lives of those who followed. Even in grief, they stitched life together. Ewan's sister, Anwin, once cut her hand deeply while slicing reeds. Their mother wrapped it in moss and linen, whispered to her softly, then gave her the last of the honey to ease the pain. They sat by the fire, just the two of them. It was the gentlest Ewan had seen his mother in weeks. He watched from the doorway, unseen, the firelight flickering across their faces. It struck him then. His mother carried the village, not in arms, but in will. Women in Glenham Hollow were not weak. They were not quiet out of submission. They were quiet out of exhaustion, out of endurance, out of 1,000 years of knowing that noise changed nothing, but work might. They bore the burdens no one praised. They stitched the wounds no one acknowledged. And somehow, they kept the world from falling apart. There were no guards in Glenham Hollow, no courthouse, no jailhouse, no iron cells beneath the earth. Justice, if it could be called that, came from the Lord's Hall, through the mouth of his steward, and it wore a cloak of fear, not fairness. 2. Live as a peasant in Dark Age Britain was to live under a law you did not write, enforced by those who seldom knew your face. Crime among peasants was not a rare thing, but neither was it always wickedness. Hunger made hands quicker. Cold made theft seem logical. And in a world where so little was truly owned, the line between what was shared and what was stolen was faint, and drawn by those who had never gone without. Still, crimes, real or imagined, were dealt with harshly. The most common punishments were fines, for breaking the manor's peace, for failing to show at court, for letting livestock wander, for impudence, a vague charge that often meant speaking out of turn. These fines were paid in grain, or chickens, or coin, if coin could be found. Those who could not pay risked worse. Public shame came next. The stocks, or the pillory, placed a man or woman before their neighbours with wrists or ankles bound, exposed to weather and ridicule. Children jeered, adults watched in silence. Sometimes rotten food was thrown. It was not just pain, it was erasure of dignity. Ewan remembered the time old Edric, near blind and nearly 70, had been found with a few apples tucked into his tunic, fallen from a tree the Lord claimed as his own. He had meant to dry them, to chew slowly through the winter. The steward was unmoved. "Theft," he declared. Edric was put in the stocks for a day and a night. When he was released, he walked with a limp and never returned to the village square. Again, the apples were trampled underfoot. Worse still were the physical punishments. Hands could be branded, ears cropped, fingers removed. These were usually reserved for repeat offenders or those deemed threats to the order, poachers, defiers of the church, or anyone foolish enough to strike another within the manor's sight. And then there was the rope. Hanging was rare in the Wa village, but not unheard of. It was carried out at the edge of the woods, where the branches of the old ash tree bent low. The body remained hanging for a day, a warning. Ewan had seen one once when he was small. He hadn't known the man, only that he had refused the boonwork, threatened the reeve, and tried to flee. He hadn't made it far. The law did not care for motive. There was no defence, no trial by one's peers. The steward, acting for the Lord, listened, or didn't, and made his ruling. The reeve enforced it, the church blessed it, and the village endured it. But justice in the hollow wasn't only official. Peasant justice was its own creature. Disputes were settled in whispers, in bargains, in quiet retaliation. A hen vanished might mean a gate left open the next night. A harsh word could earn silence in return during a time of need. Forgiveness was slow, grudges long. The villagers lived close, and no wrong ever truly disappeared. Still, there were those crimes no one spoke of, those hidden beneath the wool of decency, violence within huts, forced hands in the dark, a child bruised and silent. These matters were rarely brought before the steward. The church urged forgiveness. The reeve saw what he wished. The village held its breath. Sometimes the wise woman intervened, discreetly, effectively. A herb that made a man sleep too deeply to rise. A warning whispered into the wrong ear. But even Aelith had limits. Justice in such matters was more often sought in superstition than in law. There were customs too, ancient and sharp. Trial by ordeal still lingered in memory. Stories of a man forced to plunge his arm into boiling water to prove his innocence. If it healed cleanly, God had judged him just. If it festered, he was guilty. These rites were rarer now, but the fear of them remained. Then there was the court of the manor. Once each month the villagers gathered before the steward. The man wore furs and sat on a bench too fine for the room. Beside him, the reeve stood with his roll of parchment. Names were read, charges listed, fines passed down like cold bread. No one interrupted, no one argued. Ewan watched his father fined once for failure to maintain boundary. A stone marking the edge of their plot had shifted in the spring floods. A neighbour had reported it. The steward ruled quickly. A half-sack of barley paid to the manor. They ate nothing but onions and boiled nettles for a fortnight after. Justice for peasants was a system they did not design, spoken in a language they could not read, delivered by men who did not till soil or dig roots. It was not meant to protect, it was meant to control. And yet, within that darkness, there were flickers. Sometimes, a neighbour repaid a wrong with kindness instead of vengeance. Sometimes, stolen bread was returned with an apology, and the matter ended with a nod. Children learned these small courtesies before they could speak. The hollow had rules deeper than law, rules of survival, of sympathy. Still, fear remained. Fear that one mistake, one word, one misjudged glance could bring punishment swift and unmerciful. Ewan grew careful. He learned not just to work the soil, but to read silences, to weigh his words, to bow when needed, to bear injustice with the same posture as hunger. Because in Glenham Hollow, justice did not wear a blindfold. It wore a steward's frown and carried a book no peasant would ever touch. The peasant of Glenham Hollow did not live in a world of coin. Their wealth was measured in chickens, in sacks of grain, in the health of a single stubborn goat. They traded more than they bought, and they begged more often than they sold. But, on rare occasions, when necessity demanded or hope allowed, they made the journey beyond the hedgerows, past the tilled strips and hollow paths, to the nearest market. It lay 2 days' walk to the south, nestled in a town called Halberwick, a jumble of timber and smoke surrounded by a low, crumbling wall. For the peasants, the market might as well have been another world. It was loud, fast, and full of strangers. To walk its lanes was to feel both poor and invisible. The journey itself was arduous. Roads were little more than muddy veins worn through brush and briar, riddled with stones, often slick with rain. Bandits were a constant worry, and wolves a quieter one. Peasants rarely travelled alone. A pair, or better yet, a group, made better company and a less tempting target. When Ewan was 14, he made the trip with his uncle, carrying a basket of eggs and a bundle of herbs dried carefully by his mother. They walked for hours, camped in the cold, and arrived footsore and weary. But for Ewan, it was like stepping into a painting coloured in sounds and scents. The town was a chaos of criers' voices, squealing pigs, iron hammers and foreign tongues. Merchants barked their prices. Beggars crooned for alms. Children darted under carts with bare feet and quick hands. And everywhere was the smell of baking bread, meat roasting on spits, salted fish, and unfamiliar spices. For a boy raised on broth and barley, it was dizzying. But markets were not made for the poor. Each stall offered goods out of reach: fine wool cloaks, glass beads, knives of polished steel, sweetmeats wrapped in leaves. Ewan watched a merchant sell an apple, one perfect round apple, for more than his family might earn in a week. He held tighter to the eggs, suddenly aware of their fragility and their worth. His uncle bartered, as best he could. The herbs fetched, a handful of pennies, the eggs a few more. It was enough to buy salt, a bit of twine, and, after much debate, a small cake of beeswax for the lantern. No meat, no cloth, not even a new pair of shoes. Prices shifted like wind. A good harvest might see barley sold cheaply. A bad one might see it hoarded or sold to distant lords instead. The peasants were always last in line, always lowest in priority, and there was always the toll. Entering a town meant paying the gate fee, no matter how small the load or how tattered the shoes. Even laying out a cloth to sell your goods on the ground required permission from the reeve of the town, or a payment to the market bailiff. These fees were designed to enrich the local lord, not to encourage trade. Some peasants, unable to afford the fee, resorted to quiet, forbidden sales outside the town wall, trading eggs for bread, herbs for soap, in the shelter of low trees, or behind leaning barns. If caught, they risked punishment. But hunger was a force stronger than law. Inside the market, manners mattered. Peasants were expected to bow, to speak plainly, to not linger where their coin could not reach. The merchants rarely looked them in the eye. They served the townsfolk first, and the lord's men with smiles. To them, peasants were moving sacks of mud, useful only if they carried something to sell or coin to spend. Ewan overheard a cloth seller once describe a group of villagers as woodlice come down from the hills. He didn't understand the insult entirely, but he knew it was cruel. The man had laughed as he said it, but no one from the hollow laughed with him. Not all dealings were unjust. Some townsfolk offered fair trades. A few were kind. A baker once gave Ewan a stale loaf for free, her eyes soft as she passed it under the table. A tanner showed him how to bind a cracked sandal with thin strips of hide, and an old woman with a stall of onions sang as she sold, making everyone feel a little lighter. Still, the market was not a haven. It reminded the peasants of what they lacked, not just wealth, but voice. In town, laws were different. Some townsfolk were freemen, not bound to land or lord. They could move, marry freely, own their own stalls, their own homes. To a peasant, that freedom was dazzling and dangerous. More than one youth from Glenham Hollow had dreamed of escaping to the town, of learning a trade, becoming a freeman. But the road back was not always open. A peasant who fled could be branded a fugitive, and if caught, dragged back in shame. Only after a year and a day of hiding could one claim freedom legally. Ewan knew of one girl who had tried. Her name was Leora. Daughter of a thatcher, she vanished one autumn morning with nothing but a shawl and a dream. A year later, word came. She was living in Halberwich, married to a candlemaker's son. No one knew if it was true. Her father never spoke her name again. The market also brought danger home. With it came strangers, travellers carrying goods, yes, but also stories, and sometimes sickness. Diseases spread fast in crowds, and peasants bore the brunt. One season, a fever followed the merchants into the villages. Within a fortnight, half of a neighbouring hamlet had died. Still, they returned, because they had to. The market meant salt to preserve meat, iron to mend tools, oil to light dark nights. It meant a chance, however slim, to trade eggs for cloth, herbs for soap, dreams for something solid. It was not freedom, but it was the faint scent of it, carried on the breeze of roasted lamb and spice cider. As Ewan and his uncle trudged home with their meagre gains, the bread pressed between layers of cloth to stay dry, he looked back at the town's fading outline. It glowed faintly in the dusk, distant, unreachable, but not entirely forgotten. In the deep folds of Glenham Hollow, war was a distant rumour, an echo from the castles and hills far beyond the ploughman's horizon. But even when fought on other fields, even when no sword gleamed in the village dusk, war found its way in. Not with drums and banners, but with hunger, fear, and the sudden arrival of men who bore no love for peasants. There were no professional armies in this age. Kings summoned their lords, and the lords summoned their men, each bound by oaths and land. But those lords rarely travelled with enough food. They lived off the land they passed through. And when that land was Glenham Hollow, it was the peasants who paid the cost. The first time soldiers passed through, Ewan had been 11. He remembered the smell before anything else. Sweat, leather, smoke. Then the sound, the tramp of boots, the clink of metal. They came not in neat lines, but scattered. Riders and footmen, dust-covered and sharp-eyed. Some bore crosses on their tunics. Others wore nothing but mail and menace. They did not ask. They took. The manor's steward offered token resistance, gesturing toward the lord's tithe barns, pleading that the grain be left for winter. He was struck with the flat of a sword, not killed, just enough to remind him of his place. The soldiers emptied the barns. They took chickens, salted meat, bread still cooling on windowsills. They drank from every cask. One man snatched a ring from a woman's finger. Another spat in the chapel. The priest did not intervene. They camped just one night, but it was enough. Come morning, they left behind empty barrels, trampled gardens, and a silence thick with shame. Ewan had stared at his mother's face as she watched them ride away, expressionless, but with hands trembling as she gathered the broken fence. No compensation ever came. When lords warred, it was the peasants who lost, not only goods, but labourers. Every able-bodied man owed service if summoned. Some went willingly, dreaming of glory. Most went with dread. Few returned. War stole sons. It stole fathers. It stole seed time and harvest. For when hands left the land, the furrows lay barren. Ewan's cousin Tharn had marched to war with the Lord's retinue in the year of the Wolf Comet. He had been promised coin, armour, and a share of spoils. What he returned with, 3 years later, was a stump where his hand had been, and a hollow look in his eyes. He spoke little, laughed never. By winter, he had drowned himself in the river. Some were not even summoned. They were taken. When the King's levy grew thin. Recruiters swept through the countryside. Sometimes they took criminals. Sometimes they took the poor. Sometimes they simply took whoever they could catch. One spring, a man named Adric was seized while bringing firewood to the manor. He had never spoken against the Lord, never shirked his work, but his shoulders were strong and his legs whole. That was enough. He was marched off with 3 others. His wife gave birth without him. His child never met his eyes. Others suffered even without seeing the war. Prices rose. Taxes climbed. The church called for tithes to support the holy cause. Crusade, the priest had said one year, his voice proud, his table full. A war for God. But to the villagers, it was just another demand. Another pair of boots they had to fill. Another mouth to feed at sword point. And sometimes the war came closer. In the year of the Black Banner, a raiding party of mercenaries crossed through the region. Men who had fought in a noble's feud and lost. Now they lived by the blade, outside the bounds of law. Their leader was called Sir Yoring. Though he bore no knight's honour, his men were gaunt, hungry and cold-eyed. They set fire to the village of Denwyn, 2 days' walk east. They left none alive. Glinham Hollow braced for the same. Huts were fortified with logs and prayer. Spears were carved from broom handles. The Reeve, Dunstan, organised watches, sleepless nights on the edge of the woods. Mothers packed small satchels for flight, should the worst come. But the mercenaries turned south. Whether by whim or by better prey, no one knew. Still, the fear lingered like a wound. The villagers never walked the fields alone for months after. Even children grew quiet. The mere sight of a rider on the road brought pale faces and swift doors shut, and always war returned in stories. Tales of battles fought on distant hills, where rivers ran red and crows darkened the sky, of kings crowned and slain, of cities sieged, where rats became dinner and mothers smothered babes to spare them worse. The priest spoke of noble causes, of glory, of martyrdom, but the peasants saw only broken men and burned homes. They learned to fear the herald's horn, to dread the letter sealed with wax, to distrust any noble who rode through with too many men at his back. Even in peace, the war cast its shadow. It crept into songs, turning lullabies into laments. It lived in empty chairs and silent hearths. It settled in the way women glanced, at roads, and men sharpened scythes with more than crops in mind. Ewan, now nearly grown, kept a knife near his sleeping mat, not because he expected to fight, but because he knew better than to be unready. He did not dream of glory. He dreamt only of quiet, of seasons that passed without banners, of food that wasn't stolen, of fathers who came home. In Glinham Hollow, death was not a surprise. It was not whispered in fear or spoken of only behind doors. It walked openly among the huts and hedgerows, as constant and familiar as the changing sky. To live as a peasant in Dark Age Britain was to share one's days with the knowledge that life, though precious, was never promised. The peasant did not expect to grow old. If one did, it was viewed less as fortune and more as accident. Most were buried before their hair turned white. There were many kinds of death. Some came quietly, an infant stilled in its sleep, a cough that grew deeper by the night, a fever that burned through the flesh and left only stillness behind. Others came with pain, long and wrenching, as wounds festered or childbirth went wrong. Still others arrived in sudden, brutal moments. A tree limb in a storm, a kick from a horse, a fall from the mill ladder. And then there was the hunger, that silent predator that thinned cheeks and dimmed eyes, until the soul slipped free with barely a sigh. When someone died in the village, it was the women who tended first. They washed the body, not in luxury or warmth, but with cold water drawn from the well, sometimes warmed slightly over the hearth if fuel allowed. They closed the eyes, wrapped the limbs in the family's best cloth, and placed the body upon a board near the fire. There was no embalming, no coffin. Time was short. The earth would not wait. The burial happened quickly, often within a day, 2 at most. Delay meant decay, and the smell of rot was feared more than ghosts. The graveyard, if it could be called that, sat behind the chapel on a rise where the ground drained well. It was little more than a patch of churned earth, scattered with wooden crosses that leaned in all directions, many without names. The priest kept record, names scratched in wax tablets or remembered by heart, but the stones were too dear for common folk. Ewan had helped dig his first grave at 12. His cousin, mere days younger than him, had died from a swollen throat that choked the breath. The boy had been laughing days before, skipping stones on the stream. Now, he lay cold and rigid as Ewan helped shovel clay from the hilltop. There were no hired grave diggers. The village buried its own. The funeral rites were simple. Father Godric would mutter prayers in Latin, speak a brief word about sin and salvation, and make the sign of the cross over the body. Sometimes he sprinkled holy water, sometimes not. Then the board was tilted and the body lowered in. The earth was returned swiftly. There were no lengthy eulogies, no processions of black cloth, no offerings of lilies, only quiet sobs, the scrape of spades, and the hollow thud of dirt falling on linen. Then came the hardest part, going home, because the world did not stop for grief. A widow still had to milk the goats, a fatherless child still needed porridge. A brother, even through tears, still had to hoe the field. The body was buried, but the burden remained. And if the dead had left behind debt or had failed in labour duties, their family bore the cost. The manor took its Harriet, the best beast or a coin if no beast remained. The church might still demand a tithe for the burial, regardless of whether grain was left to give. Death, then, was not an escape. It was a transfer of grief, of debt, of silence. But not all were mourned the same. Infants were mourned with quiet weeping, often beneath breath. So many did not survive their first winter that the villagers learned to brace themselves from the first cry. Some mothers refused to name their child until they'd seen at least 2 springs. Women who died in childbirth were buried with whispered prayers and a sense of fatalism. The Lord gives and takes, the priest would say, as if to imply balance. But those who lived with the loss did not always agree. Men who died in war were sometimes praised if the priest approved the cause, but most often they were simply missed, their tools hung up or passed along, their names mentioned less each year until only the oldest remembered. And then there were those who died wrong, a man who took his own life, a woman found drowned in suspicious circumstance. These bodies were buried without rites, often outside the graveyard fence. It was said their souls wandered. Children were warned not to walk too close to their graves. Still, grief found its way. It lived in the worn prayer beads clutched tighter at night, in the loaf baked without the missing hand, in the silence at the table where once there had been a voice. The villagers bore their sorrow without ceremony, but not without feeling. Some planted herbs on graves, sage for remembrance, thyme for courage. Others carved initials into trees. A few left offerings, a carved trinket, a bone flute, a lock of hair tied with string. These things would be scattered by rain and wind, but the act itself was enough. And on All Souls' Day, the chapel was filled with candles. Each flame, a life remembered, a grief held close. Ewan had lit candles each year since his sister's passing. He remembered her laugh, the way she used to dance in circles with flowers in her hair. He spoke her name aloud only once a year. That was the custom. To speak too, often was to tempt the spirits to linger. The dead were honoured, but they were also feared. Ghost stories were more than fiction. They were warnings. Spirits who returned were those with unfinished business, with angry deaths, or with no prayers to guide them. It was said that a proper burial, with the right words and an honest heart, sent the souls safely away. So the peasants did what they could. They buried the dead with hands that had tilled and mended and raised. They wept, quietly, but truly. They prayed, sometimes to God, sometimes to something older, older than books and bells. And then they rose the next morning, because the earth still needed turning, because bread still needed baking, because death might wait a day, but life never did. It would be a mistake to think the peasants of Glinham Hollow were without dreams. Though their backs bent beneath yokes and their fingers stiffened from cold, their hearts still stirred with visions, not of castles or crowns, but of something simpler, warmer, kinder. Hope lived, though it was thin as a spring reed and just as easily broken. For what else could keep a man going through endless winters and ceaseless toil? But the quiet, persistent whisper that life might one day be more than survival. The dreams of peasants were not grand. Ewan, like many, had never imagined himself a knight or a king, but he often wondered what it might be like to own his own land. Truly own it, not borrow it season to season. A single strip, perhaps, where he might plant what he pleased, with no steward's gaze watching, no toll demanded, no tithe extracted like marrow from bone. He imagined a small hut with a chimney that didn't smoke back inside, a bed where the straw didn't mould, a door that shut tightly and opened only when he wished it to. He imagined a table with meat on it, real meat. Not a scrap tossed in stew, but a roasted joint, fragrant and full. He imagined, most of all, a day without fear. Such dreams were rarely spoken aloud. To hope too openly was to tempt disappointment. The church taught that ambition bred sin, that patience was piety, that the meek would inherit, but not yet. Still, the villagers found ways to feed their longing. Some turned to tales, old as root and river. There were stories of enchanted forests, where a peasant might stumble upon a fairy hill and return with a pouch of gold, of talking animals who rewarded kindness, of green men who slept beneath the oaks and whispered secrets to those who truly listened. Children believed, and their parents let them, because belief was softer than truth, because even false light can warm. Every home had charms, a bundle of herbs above the door, a scrap of iron nailed to a threshold, a carved stone with a hole in the center hung from a string in the garden to keep away the ill breath. These weren't just superstition. They were quiet acts of resistance against fate, against hunger, against the Lord's decree that the world would always be so. Even the church, for all its disdain, allowed some leeway in these customs. Father Godric turned a blind eye to maypole dances, to midsummer bonfires, to the placing of wildflowers in shoes for luck. He muttered warnings about paganism, but he understood in his own grim way that the soul needed more than sermons. The wise woman, Aelith, was keeper of many of these old ways. Though feared by some, she was loved by others, especially the women. She sang when she worked. She spoke to bees. She scattered salt in crossroads and muttered to the moon. She also taught. She taught girls how to brew teas that eased the pain of birth, and boys how to read weather from the wind. She said dreams were seeds, that if planted carefully, they might one day bloom. Once, Ewan had brought her a carving he'd made, a fox, small and crude, whittled from firewood. She turned it over in her hands, smiled and said, "You've got more in you than furrows and frost, lad." It was the first praise he'd received that hadn't come with a command. Sometimes hope flickered brighter when the harvest was good, when the first calf of spring survived, when a neighbour shared without being asked, when laughter echoed across the fields despite aching limbs. Once, a wandering minstrel passed through, carrying a lute and 1,000 tales. He sang in the square, and the villagers gathered, wide-eyed. He spoke of a city where bread was sold by the loaf and not the handful, of a land beyond the sea where even the poor drank from glass. Most knew he was exaggerating, but they listened anyway, because sometimes a lie well told was more nourishing than truth. Still, there were other dreams, darker ones, dreams of defiance. The village remembered, though quietly, the stories of those who had risen against their lords. The Great Rising, they called it, when men and women marched with pitchforks and courage, demanding freedom, dignity, bread. It had failed. The kings had crushed them, their leaders hanged, their villages burned, but the memory endured. Ewan had once seen a mark carved into the bark of a tree deep in the woods, a symbol his father told him to forget. "Rebellion," he whispered, then spat to break the curse. "Don't ask. Don't. Look again." But Ewan had remembered. He thought of it often on long days in the fields, when his hands bled from the haft of a hoe and the reeve's shadow stretched across the soil like a net. Perhaps one day, perhaps, hope came in strange forms, in a child's laugh, in a loaf that rose just right, in a clear night sky unmarred by storm, in the way Mara, Ewan's mother, once sat still beside the fire and hummed. No words, just a tune her mother had taught her, and her mother before that. It was not joy, not quite, but it was something close. In the cracks between the weight of labour and the pull of law, the peasants held on to hope like a coal tucked deep in a winter hearth. Small, glowing, alive. And though the world told them they were born to serve, to kneel, to suffer, they dreamed, even if only in silence. And sometimes that was enough. In the end, for all the hunger, for all the lashes, for all the smoke-thick mornings and frost-bitten nights, the true weight of a peasant's life in Dark Age Britain was not in the suffering alone, but in its repetition. Life was a circle, unbroken, unyielding, and the hardest truth was this: no matter how bravely they bore the burden, no matter how kindly they lived, their children would likely carry the same. In Glenham Hollow, time did not pass. It turned, like the great millstone, like the seasons, like the slow arc of the sun across a sky that never changed. Ewan, now near manhood, had begun to see it for what it was. He saw it in the lines forming on his mother's face, once so firm, now softened by wear. He saw it in the way his father's stride had shortened, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the plough. He saw it in the children now chasing hens in the yard, as he had once done, while their parents bent double in the fields. And he saw it most of all in himself. He had grown taller, broader. He had learned the ways of seed and soil, of how to read the sky for storm, of which root to chew for pain. He had buried family, celebrated births, patched roofs, split wood, and watched over the fire on wind-blown nights. His voice no longer cracked. His fingers had thickened. His dreams, once wild and defiant, now whispered softly, asking only for a little comfort, a little peace. But even as he matured, the path ahead narrowed. He was bound to the land. It was not his. It never would be. And yet it claimed him just the same, by law, by blood, by custom. To leave would be to abandon his family, risk punishment, face a world even less forgiving. To stay was to accept the yoke, worn now by so many before. Him it fit without protest. The village changed slowly, if at all. Thatched roofs caved and were rebuilt. Paths deepened with each passing foot. The trees at the edge of the forest grew thicker. But names remained, duties remained, and each year the faces of the dead were replaced by those of the newly grown. Children became labourers. Labourers became parents. Parents became burdens, then memories, and yet there was dignity in it too, not the kind found in chronicles or carved upon stone, but a quiet, durable dignity, the dignity of survival, of holding fast despite the storm, of rising again and again when nothing called you but the day's need. Peasants did not compose history books. They could not write. but they were history's marrow. Every castle stood on their shoulders. Every night was fed by their labor. Every priest owed his clean robe to the wool they sheared, the bread they baked, the coins they surrendered. The nobles might rule, but it was the peasant who turned the wheel, and so life passed on. The rituals continued. Bread was baked before dawn. The chapel bell rang at dusk. Crops were rotated, tools repaired, births whispered, and deaths endured. And in between these things, life breathed. On May Day, flowers still adorned the well. On feast days, there was music. Simple tunes plucked on strings, pounded on drums, hummed between lines of labor. Laughter still echoed across the fields when the barley swayed golden beneath the sun. Ewan once saw a young couple dancing in the rain, their arms around each other, spinning barefoot in the mud. No one stopped them. The village watched, and, for a moment, even Dunstan the Reeve smiled. In moments like that, the circle did not seem cruel. It seemed ancient, beautiful, a rhythm too old to question, too deep to unseat. Still, there were those who asked quietly what might lie beyond. The old tales said that one day the world would change, that kings would fall, that lords would lose their power, that the common man would rise and no longer bow. Some mocked the stories. Others passed them along in firelit whispers. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps in centuries to come, someone would dig through the ruins of a manor house and find the truth that the hands who built it never owned it. That the names in the manor roll were not the only ones that mattered, but for Ewan and for all those like him, the present mattered more. There was barley to plant, a fence to mend, a sister's wedding to prepare for, a roof to patch before, the autumn rains. These were not grand battles, but they were his. They gave shape to his days, and so he worked, not with joy, always, but with purpose. Because in the end, the peasant did not dream of glory. He dreamed of warmth, of bread enough, of children safe in sleep, of the spring sun returning after frost, of small things held close. And those dreams, though humble, carried the world. As the sun dipped low behind the western hedgerow, casting long golden shadows across Glinham Hollow, Ewan stood at the edge of the field, hands on hips, earth beneath his nails. He looked over the land that was not his, yet more a part of him than his own bones. And he nodded once, slow and certain. Tomorrow, the work would begin again. But tonight, he would sit beside the fire. He would eat what little they had. He would listen to his mother hum, and he would endure.